She walked into the shooting range with something to prove, gripping her pistol, like it was the only thing that still made sense in her chaotic week. The fluorescent lights above buzzed quietly, blending with the muffled cracks of distant gunfire. The scent of spent shells and oil filled the air, sharp and metallic, but oddly comforting to her. It was her first time back since the breakup, since the promotion fell through, since the friend who said she would always be there suddenly wasn't. And now it was just her and the weapon and the hollow paper target standing at the end of the lane, daring her to miss, daring her to fail again. She checked in with the bored teenager at the counter, signed the waiver like she had done before, chose the same booth on the far end because she liked the quiet corner, and because no one there ever tried to give her advice. She liked it that way. She liked the silence between the shots and the brief control she could feel when her finger rested. On the trigger, she placed her gear down with mechanical rhythm, unzipped her case, and stared at the gun like it was an old friend who had never judged her, just listened, just waited, just existed in quiet agreement with her anger. She slipped on her ear protection, loaded her pistol with the bullets clicking into place like notes in a song she was still learning to play, and took her stance, feet shoulder-width apart, arms up, chest tight, heart even tighter. She exhaled slowly, raised the gun, and fired once the shot echoed back at her, not too loud, but not soft either, like a slap. That reminded her she was still here, still solid. The first bullet hit. Low left. She adjusted and fired again. This time, better, closer, sent her closer to the feeling of control she was desperate to reclaim. 2 lanes over someone else, fired a shot louder, deeper, more precise. She glanced to her side, but saw only the edge of a figure, tall, broad shoulders, calm posture. Whoever it was, they knew what they were doing. She told herself to focus, to stay in her own lane, and fired 3 more rounds, each one carving a path closer to the middle of the target. But something in her wrist felt off. Something in her breathing still rushed her chest, rising too fast her. Fingers gripping too hard, it wasn't enough to shoot. She wanted to shoot right. The man moved closer now into the lane beside hers, not saying anything yet, but with a presence that was hard to ignore. He had a case of his own, longer, heavier, and the way he handled it said everything. He was comfortable here too. Comfortable maybe, but not like her. His comfort didn't come from escape. His came from experience. He opened the case slowly, carefully revealing a rifle unlike anything she had ever seen, polished but worn, elegant but rugged, like it had lived through something and survived. He didn't look at her right away. Didn't need to. He checked his scope, checked his ammo, loaded the rifle like it was second nature, like it was breathing, then finally turned his head slightly and glanced at her, just one look enough to make her freeze, not in fear, but in recognition. She didn't know him, but she knew men like him, or rather she thought she did. Calm eyes, tired eyes, the kind that had seen things and didn't speak of them, the kind that didn't need to speak to be heard. She returned her eyes to her target, aimed, fired again. The shot landed just shy of center, and she let out a small breath. 1 part frustration, 1 part pride. She hadn't lost her touch, not entirely, but it still wasn't enough. She wanted better, she needed better, and somehow the man next to her felt like part of the answer. Even if she didn't know the question yet, he didn't speak. Just watched her next. Shot with a slight tilt of his head, then finally said low and measured. "Your grip is strong, but your breathing is wrong. You're rushing the moment." She turned to him slightly, eyebrows raised, not angry, just surprised. People didn't usually talk. To her here, that was the unspoken rule. You stayed in your lane, but something in his voice, something in his delivery didn't annoy her. It intrigued her the way he said it. Not like a teacher, not like a stranger offering a tip, but like someone who understood what it meant to need to get something right, because sometimes right was all you had. She considered him for a moment, then turned back to the target, fired once more. The shot landed clean, but off to the right. She exhaled loud enough for him to hear, and he stepped forward a little closer, not invading, just present like a guide in unfamiliar territory. Then he said the line that would stick with her. Long after the day was over. If you're only fighting the target, you're not. Learning to control the fight. And with that, he lifted his rifle, stepped into position, and showed her how stillness could be more powerful than fury. How precision could be more powerful than pressure. She watched him move with quiet certainty. The kind of certainty that only comes from repetition, from survival, from moments when mistakes were not allowed and failure was not an option. He set the rifle on the rest, adjusted the scope, and breathed. In so slowly she barely saw his chest rise, and then the shot came sudden, clean, deafening, but in a different way. Not like hers, not forced or angry, but like the air itself moved out of respect for it. The bullet hit the dead center of the target, not a millimeter off, and for a second she forgot to breathe at all. She looked at the target, then at him, her mouth slightly open. Not from awe exactly, but from the sharp shift in perspective she had seen skilled shooters before, had even trained. Under one or two. But this was something else. This was someone who had trained not for sport or recreation, but for survival. His hands were steady, not because they were strong, but because they had been through storms she could only imagine, and now those same hands had taken the time to help her fix her stance like it meant something. He glanced over at her almost casually and said, "You want to try and—" Before she could talk herself out of it, her head was nodding and her feet were moving toward the bench. And then suddenly the rifle was in her hands, heavier than she thought, colder too, like it carried its own history. And maybe it did. Maybe it had been halfway across the world. Maybe it had been fired in silence at night in places. That never made the news. She raised it carefully and he moved beside her without a word, adjusting her elbow, tilting her shoulder, guiding her weight onto her back foot like a sculptor fine-tuning a statue. She felt the difference instantly. This was not the stance she used when trying to prove she could shoot. This was the stance of someone trying to survive, and in that moment she wasn't sure which version of herself she had been trying to be, but she knew she wanted to learn from this version, from the one he seemed to know so well. She exhaled slowly, the way he told her, and watched the crosshairs line up on the paper target, which now felt less like a test and more like a challenge. And then she squeezed the trigger. The sound was louder than she expected, but it didn't rattle her. It rolled through her chest and down her spine, and she felt the recoil not as a punishment, but as a reminder. And when she lowered the rifle and saw the hole near the center of the target, just shy of perfect, she smiled in spite of herself and turned to him to find him already watching her with the smallest hint of a grin, the kind that said, "Not bad, but also you can do better." She laughed quietly, unsure what to say, and he said nothing. Just reached to take the rifle from her and reload it like it was nothing like. This moment didn't mean something, and maybe to him it didn't. Maybe this was just a quiet day at the range for someone who had lived 1,000 loud ones, or maybe he saw something in her, some restless energy, some need to aim that reminded him of something or someone he used to know, and he decided to offer her a glimpse of something steadier. She shot again and again, and each time he gave one correction. Not too much, never too much, just enough to make her think, and each time the bullet hit closer to center until on the 6th round, it struck dead on, and she let out a laugh that felt lighter than any sound she had made all week, and it startled her. A little. How good it felt to hit something right where she wanted to, when so much else in her life felt like it was missing the mark. He stepped back, arms crossed, eyes on the target, as if confirming it wasn't a fluke, and then said, "You ever shoot outside the range?" And she shook her head. Said, "No, not really." And he nodded like he expected that answer, and looked down the lane like he was remembering somewhere far away and said, "It's different out there. Everything's different. But the shot stays the same." And she didn't know exactly what he meant, but she knew she wanted to understand. They stood in silence for a minute, the kind of silence that was comfortable, like an old coat. And then she said, "You military?" And he looked at her and said something so simple it felt heavy. "I used to be." and then turned back to his gear like that was all the story he needed to tell, and maybe it was because the rest was written in his posture and his voice and the way he breathed before pulling the trigger, and she didn't need the details, because she already knew he was the kind of man whose story was made of moments, not words. And in that quiet space between shot and echo, she realized she had learned more in the last 20 minutes than in all her sessions combined, not just about shooting, but about focus and balance and presence. And maybe that's why she kept looking at him, hoping he'd offer another lesson, even if he never said a word. She stayed at the range longer than she planned, reloading the rifle again, feeling the weight of it less foreign each time, and now, with him beside her, something had shifted in the air. Not romantic, not dramatic, but heavy with purpose, like being. Around him made everything she was doing matter more. He had that effect. His silence was not awkward, but watchful. Like every shot she took, he was measuring, not just the aim, but her focus, her control, her intent, and she found herself wanting his approval, though she would never admit it out loud. He showed her how to breathe deeper, slower, more deliberate, and when she asked how he learned all this, he said quietly, "Years in places where a breath too fast could mean a mission gone wrong," and she didn't press further. She didn't need to. The way he carried himself said enough. He wasn't showing off. He was remembering, and remembering wasn't always easy. Sometimes it took more strength than speaking, and she respected that. She admired that more than she knew how to say. The target paper was peppered with holes now, but one round stood out a perfect center, a shot that even surprised her, and when she looked at him for a reaction, he just nodded once. Not a big gesture, but one that felt bigger than it looked, like a mentor telling a student, "Well done," without words. She lowered the rifle, leaned back against the booth wall, and let the weight of the moment settle into her muscles, into her mind. "What made you come here?" she asked, finally curious, but careful not to sound too curious, and he answered just needed to feel the recoil again, and she knew exactly what he meant without explanation, because the world outside was too quiet sometimes, and the noise of the range was oddly grounding. It made sense in a way life often didn't. The cause and effect, the sound and the result, the aim and the hit, it all lined up if you did it right, and she craved that kind of clarity. He checked his watch and then his rifle methodically, wiping it down, securing each piece like it was a ritual, not just maintenance, and she watched the way he moved, how nothing was wasted. No extra motion, no fidgeting, just action, shaped by discipline, and maybe lost too. She couldn't tell, but she wondered, and before she could think twice, she asked, what was it like? And he looked up at her. Not angry, not surprised, just quiet for a moment. Then said, it was real. That was all just real. She thought about that word, about how it meant different things to different people. How for her real was pain and confusion and trying to stay afloat, but for him real was probably desert air and bullet casings and men he called brothers and nights spent waiting for orders that might never come, and in that moment she felt like her world was so small compared to his, and yet here they were side by side sharing a space where the only thing that mattered was the next shot. "You ever miss it?" she asked, not because she expected an answer, but because the silence was starting to fill with too many questions, and he surprised her by saying, "Every damn day," then followed it with a small, tired smile like he didn't regret it, but still carried it, and she felt that too in her own way, in a different form, in the choices she made, the people she let go of, the moments she wished she could return to and shoot cleaner than she had the first time. She raised the rifle again, fired once more, hit slightly right, and heard his voice behind her say, "You," flinched right before the pull, and she nodded without turning because he was right, and she appreciated how he saw things clearly, how he didn't sugarcoat it, how his feedback wasn't about judgment but about improvement, and that made her want to get better, not just at shooting, but at everything. He adjusted her stance once more, this time his hand lingering just a second longer than before. Not inappropriate, not bold, just enough to remind her that they were both still human, still breathing. still present, and that maybe this wasn't just a lesson anymore. Maybe it was the beginning of something she hadn't expected. As she fired again and hit closer to center, she felt something shift inside her, something like confidence, but also like calm. And when she lowered the rifle and turned to face him, he was already packing up his gear slowly, carefully, like the session had ended, and the moment was slipping away. She wanted to ask if he'd come back tomorrow, if he did this often, if he ever taught more than one lesson, but the words stayed in her throat, and instead she just said, "Thanks," and he nodded again, said, "You did good," and walked away with the rifle case slung over his shoulder, disappearing down the hall like a ghost that came to teach her one thing and left before she could ask why. She stood there watching the empty lane beside her, the smell of gunpowder still thick in the air, and felt a strange kind of silence settle in, one that wasn't lonely or sad, just full, like something important had happened, and she knew this wasn't the end. It was only part of the story. The next shot was still hers to take. She did not return to the range for 3 days, not because she didn't want to, but because part of her was unsure if he would be there again, and the thought of showing up and finding only silence kept her away longer than she planned. But the rifle, the lesson, the weight of his voice all stayed with her louder than the world around her. She thought about the way he adjusted her stance, how precise it felt, how natural, how rare it was to feel so focused, so still, and she knew she would go back even if he wasn't there because something had shifted in her and it could not be ignored. When she finally walked through the doors again, the staff behind the counter looked up, recognized her and gave a small nod, and she made her way to the same booth at the far end, not expecting anything, just ready to shoot again, to feel the kick and the control, to find her rhythm. But when she stepped into her lane, she saw the note. A small square of paper folded neatly, sitting where she usually placed her gear, and her breath caught for a second before she opened it. "Good shooting last time, same time next week. If you want to train again," and it wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. She knew it was him. Knew it by the handwriting. Sharp and steady, just like his voice, and without even realizing it, she smiled, tucked the note into her jacket, and began setting up her gear. Heart pounding with a mix of nerves and anticipation, because now the range was no longer just a place. To practice it was a place where something began, something unexpected, something that made her feel seen. The next week arrived slower than usual, and when the day finally came, she was there 10 minutes early, checking her gear twice, trying not to look anxious, even though she was. And when he walked in, dressed the same plain shirt, calm steps, quiet eyes. She felt something ease inside her, like the universe had remembered a promise and followed through without making a sound. He nodded to her. Once then, stepped into the lane beside her like no time had passed, and without a word they began again. He brought a different rifle, this time shorter, more compact, and when she asked about it, he said, "This one's for speed, not distance," and she nodded, took it from him carefully, and followed his instructions without hesitation, without question, because something about his presence made her want to trust, made her want to listen, and when she fired the first shot and saw it land just left of center, he said, "You're improving," and it meant more than she expected it to. Like a weight lifting off her shoulders, even if just for a moment. They trained in near silence, only speaking when necessary, and it never felt awkward, only deliberate. Each word chosen, each adjustment purposeful. And she began to understand that he taught not just with instruction, but with presence, that his lessons were about more than accuracy. They were about discipline, about stillness, about owning every motion and every breath. And she began to apply it not just here, but everywhere at work, in conversations, even in the way she walked into a room. After the session, he packed up slowly like before, and she stood there wondering if he would leave again without a word. But this time he paused, looked at her and said, "You shoot like someone who's trying to find something." And she didn't know what to say because it was true, because that was exactly how she felt. And he added, The range is a good place too. Look sometimes, and then he walked away without waiting for her response, and she stood there alone again, but not the same. She returned every week after that, always to the same lane, always wondering what new lesson he would bring. And every time, he showed up exactly when he said he would, never early, never late. Like he measured time the same way he measured a target, with precision and intention, and she learned more with each visit, not just about shooting, but about herself, about how to be in her body, about how to silence the noise inside her mind. And after a while, she realized she no longer came for the shots. Alone she came, because in those moments beside him, everything felt aligned. One evening, after a particularly sharp session, where her final shot split the center of the target clean, he looked at her for a long second, and then asked, "Why did you start shooting?" And she hesitated. Not because she didn't know, but because she had never said it out loud. And then finally, she answered, "Because I needed to feel in control of something, anything." And he nodded, like he understood, like he knew exactly what that felt like. And for the first time, she saw something shift in his eyes, something like softness, or maybe memory. And in that shared silence, something unspoken passed between them. That was the night she realized she wanted to know more about him. Not just the shooter, not just the teacher, but the man behind the calm, the story behind the scars. And she almost asked something personal, but held back, unsure if the moment was ready, unsure if he was, and instead she just said thank you again. And he gave her a rare smile, not wide, not loud, but real, and then said, "See you next week." And with that he was gone. But the weight of the evening stayed with her like the echo of a shot that kept ringing long after the sound had faded. She could not stop thinking about that smile, the one he gave her at the end of their last session. It had been small, subtle, but it stayed with her louder than any word he had ever spoken. And now she found herself arriving at the range with a different kind of anticipation, not just for the rifle, not just for the shots, but for the space they created together, that strange, quiet rhythm between them where nothing had to be explained and everything still made sense. She wondered what it would be like to know him outside these walls, to see how he moved through a world that was not built for men like him. Men who carried silence like a second skin and memories like invisible medals he never asked for. But the range was the only place she saw him, and maybe that was enough. Maybe it had to be, because part of her knew that men like him did not let people in easily, and maybe that was why it mattered so much that he let her in even a little. That afternoon she arrived early again this time, with something different tucked into her gear bag. Not a weapon, not a note, just a question, one she had carried for weeks, but had not found the courage to ask. Yet she didn't even know how to form it exactly. All she knew was that when she looked at him, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, something steady, something rare, and even if nothing ever came of it, she needed to know if he felt it too. He arrived exactly on time as always, nodding once, setting up his rifle without a word. And she did the same, trying not to stare, trying not to let the question leak out of her eyes while they fired round after round. She noticed his shoulders were more tense today, his jaw tighter, his focus sharper than usual, and she wondered what ghost he was fighting in his mind, what memory had risen like smoke between his breaths. "You okay?" she asked quietly between shots, and he paused, looked at her, then back at the target, and said, "Yeah, just a rough week," and she didn't press. She only nodded and loaded her next magazine slower this time, as if to match the weight he was carrying. He watched her shoot, said nothing at first, then finally corrected her grip with a gentler touch than usual, and she wondered if this too was his way of speaking when words would not come. After the last shot rang out, he set the rifle down and leaned against the booth. Arms crossed, eyes unfocused, and she stepped beside him. Not sure what made her do it, but she did it anyway and said, "Do you ever let people in, like really in?" And the question hung there like a loaded weapon between them. neither of them moving, neither of them breathing for a long second, and then he said, "Not often." And that was all. But it was enough. She nodded, and they stood, there in silence, but it wasn't empty. It was full of things they could not say, full of things they were still learning how to feel, and she thought maybe that was the beginning of something not loud, not sudden, but real, something that moved as slow and precise as the trigger pull before a clean shot. He turned to her and said, "I'm heading out for a while. Next week might not make it back right away," and something inside her dropped a little, though she kept her face calm and just said, "Where to?" And he shook his head slightly, somewhere quiet. "Just need some time." And she nodded again because she understood. Because sometimes the world got too loud, and silence was the only thing that made sense, and she wanted to say, "Take care," or "Be safe," or "I'll miss this." But none of those words came out. Instead, she said, "Okay, let me know when you're back." And he said, "I will," and then he picked up his case, gave her one final look, and walked away, the same way he always did. But this time, something about it felt heavier, like a door closing softly behind him, not locked, not final, just waiting for the right key to open it again. She stayed a while longer, fired a few more rounds, but her aim was off her hands, restless, her chest tight. And when she finally packed up and left the note he had written weeks ago, slipped out of her jacket, and she looked at it again, worn at the edges, creased from being folded and refolded, and she wondered if maybe she should write one of her own. That night. She sat at her desk with a pen in hand and stared at a blank piece of paper, unsure what to say. Unsure what would matter to a man like him, and in the end, she wrote just one line. "Hope you find what you're looking for," and she signed it. Not with her name, but with the initials he had once asked about and remembered ever since. And then she folded it quietly, placed it inside her range bag, and decided she would leave it next time, just in case he returned when she was not there, because some lessons are too important to forget, and some people leave without knowing they were the thing you needed to aim straighter, breathe deeper, and pull the trigger with purpose. She left the note inside the small locker at the end of the range, the one he always used when he came in early to gear up quiet and unseen. She tucked it behind the cleaning cloths, folded flat and unassuming like a secret, waiting for the right hands to open it, and when she shut the door, she stood there a moment, palms on metal, eyes closed, just listening to the stillness around her and wondering when or if he would find it at all. Days passed, then a week, then two, and still no sign of him. She kept coming back to the range, each session quieter than the last. The routine steady but empty, like a song missing its rhythm. She tried not to think about it too much. Tried to focus on her form, on her breathing, on the sharp, clean recoil, but even her perfect shots felt hollow now, like echoes with no one to hear them. Sometimes she caught herself glancing down the hallway at the entrance every time the door opened. Her heart would jump a little, then settle with the same low thud of disappointment. And yet she kept coming back because some part of her believed he would return, because men like him don't just disappear. They pull back when they need space, and she was learning to respect that silence even when it hurt. One evening, just as she was packing up her gear, the range officer walked by, paused, and said, "You're the one who trains with the SEAL, right?" And she looked up, startled. Not at the question, but at the fact someone had noticed, and she nodded slowly, and the officer said, "He was in last night, left this for you," and handed her a folded slip of paper, small and neat, like the one she had left for him, and for a moment she couldn't move. She waited until she was outside, until the wind touched her face and the street. Noise filled the space around her, and only then did she unfold it and read the words written in that same sharp, steady handwriting. "I found what I was looking for. I just didn't know it was at the range every Thursday," and her fingers trembled. A little not from shock, but from something warmer, something deeper, something she had not dared name until now. The next Thursday she arrived early, heart-pounding, unsure what to expect, unsure if he would be there or if the note had been his way, of saying goodbye, but when she stepped into her lane, she saw him standing there, back turned, adjusting his scope like he had never left, like he had always been there. And when he turned to face her, there was something in his eyes softer than before, but no less sure, and she smiled before she could stop herself. "You came back," she said quietly, and he nodded. "Said I needed time, but I kept thinking about that shot. You made the last one." And she laughed because she knew that wasn't the real reason. And he knew she knew, and somehow that made it better, more honest, more real. And they began again side by side, rifles in hand, words unnecessary. This time their silence was different, not filled with questions, but with understanding. She no longer needed to ask where he had been or what he had seen, and he no longer needed to explain why the range felt like home. Because now they both understood what it meant to find peace in precision and purpose in practice, and maybe even something like healing in the sound of gunfire echoing through empty lanes. After the session, he didn't pack up right away. Instead, he leaned back against the wall, arms crossed, looking at her like he was seeing her for the first time. Not just as a shooter, not just as someone learning to aim, but as someone who had waited, who had believed, who had chosen to show up even when she didn't have to, and that mattered more than any target ever could. "You kept coming back," he said, and she nodded. "I wasn't done learning." And he said neither was I. And for a while they just stood there like that, quiet, close, breathing the same air and sharing the same space. And then he said, "You ever shoot outside city limits?" And she shook her head. Said no. And he said next, "We come with me. I know a place." And she hesitated, not from fear, but from the weight of what that invitation meant. "Okay," she said finally, and he smiled again. Not the small smile from before, but something fuller, something brighter, and for the first time she saw what he looked like without the weight of war behind his eyes, and it made her heart ache in a way that was not painful but honest, because now she wasn't just learning how to shoot, she was learning how to stay steady when something important is finally in your sights. She met him at the edge of town just after sunrise, the road stretching out behind her, the horizon painted in soft gold and quiet mist. She had never been out this way before, never driven past the familiar signs and safe streetlights. But something about today felt different, like she was stepping into a place where things mattered more and words meant less, where silence carried answers and presence was a language of its own. He was already there, leaning against his truck, arms folded, rifle case by his side, his expression unreadable but calm like always. And when she pulled up, he gave her a single nod, the kind that said, "I'm glad you came," without needing to say anything else. She stepped out of the car, the morning air crisp and cool, and followed him without question across the field to a clearing surrounded by trees and sky and the scent of pine that reminded her of old stories and untold truths. "This is where I learned to shoot," he said, finally, voice low, almost reverent. "My father taught me here before the military, before everything else." And she looked around at the rough terrain, the handmade targets set against logs, the quiet wind brushing through the grass, and she felt something sacred in the space, like it held more than just memories, like it still remembered the hands that had trained here, the footsteps that had paced here, the breath held before every clean shot. He handed her the rifle without ceremony, but with trust, and she took it gently, adjusting her grip by instinct, now remembering every lesson he had taught her, every quiet correction, every wordless look that said, "You're getting better." And she aimed without rushing, let her body settle, let her heart quiet, and fired, the shot ringing out clear and sharp into the open air. "Nice grouping," he said, stepping beside her, his voice closer now, his presence steady and familiar, and she smiled. Not just from pride, but from knowing he meant it not as a compliment, but as a recognition, a mark of progress, a way of saying, "I see how far you've come," without needing more than a few words. They spent hours out there, the world shrinking down to just the two of them, and the sound of rifles and breath and gravel underfoot. He told her stories. In pieces, stories that were more feeling than fact, fragments of places he had been, things he had seen, people he had lost. And she listened not with sympathy, but with respect, because these were not stories for pity. They were pieces of a puzzle. He was still learning how to fit together. She told him her own truths, not all at once, but enough for him to understand the weight she carried. The expectations, the mistakes, the moments when everything had fallen apart, and she thought maybe no one would ever really see her again, and he listened the way he did, everything fully without judgment and without the need to fix, just present, just there. At one point they stopped shooting, sat on the tailgate of his truck, the afternoon sun warming, their backs the wind soft and slow, and she looked over at him and said, "Do you ever think you'll go back?" And he shook his head. "Not anymore." I think I already gave everything I had, and she didn't say anything, just nodded, because she knew what it meant to give too much and still feel like it wasn't enough. He looked at her, then really looked and said, "You know, I never thought I'd find this again, this feeling." And she tilted her head, curious what feeling. And he said, "Calm, like I can breathe, like I'm not bracing for something," and she didn't realize until that moment that he had always been bracing, even when he was still even. When he was teaching her, there had always been something in his body held tight like a trigger, half pulled. She reached over, touched his hand gently. Not a bold move, just real, and his fingers curled around hers, slow, careful, like he was afraid to break something delicate, and they sat like that for a long while, saying nothing. Just watching. The wind moved through the trees and the clouds shift above them, and she thought, maybe this was what healing looked like. Not dramatic, not sudden, just two people showing up again and again, choosing to be there, even when it was easier to disappear. When the sun started to lower, he stood, helped her pack the gear, and before they left, he turned back toward the clearing, looked out over the targets and the quiet space, and said, "We'll come back here," and she said, "Yeah, we will." And they didn't make promises or plans. They just drove back into town with the windows down and the silence between them soft and full and alive. The following weeks passed like pages turning in a book they had both forgotten how to read. Slow, steady, filled with moments that meant more than they admitted. Each Thursday became more than just a range day, more than training, more than habit. It became a tether, a quiet rhythm. Neither of them wanted to break. She would arrive early. Sometimes he would beat her there, but they always left together. Not because they planned to, but because neither of them knew how to walk away anymore. They didn't talk about what it was or what it was becoming, maybe because naming it would change it, maybe because they both knew what it felt like to lose something that finally made sense, and so they protected the space between them like it was made of glass, but not fragile. Glass, strong glass, the kind that could stop a bullet if placed just right. She noticed the way he laughed more now, not often and not loudly, but enough that it surprised her each time, like a small light flickering in. A room she never thought would be warm again, and he noticed the way her hand stopped shaking when she loaded her magazine, the way her shoulders stayed relaxed even under pressure, and it made him proud in a way he had not felt since long before. He left the uniform behind, one evening after the range had closed and the last echoes of gunfire had faded. They stayed behind alone in the parking lot, sitting on the hood of her car, watching the sky shift from deep blue to darker shades filled with stars. She asked him what it was like to come home. Really come home, and he was quiet for a while, then said, "It's like learning how to walk again, but everyone expects you to run." And she didn't say anything because there was nothing to fix, only space to share. She asked him if he missed it, and he said sometimes. But not the way most people think. "I don't miss the chaos. I miss the clarity. I miss knowing what mattered and what didn't." And she understood because lately she was starting to see what mattered too. Not titles, not numbers, not deadlines, but these moments, quiet, real ones, that didn't need to prove anything to be everything. He turned to her, then eyes clearer than they had ever been, and said, "You're the first person who doesn't look at me like I'm broken." And she looked back at him and said, "That's because you're not." And for a second the world held its breath, and they were just two people who had survived different battles, but found the same peace in each other. They didn't kiss, not then, not yet. Because the story wasn't finished, because some chapters deserve to be written with patience and presence, not rushed, not forced, just lived. And she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he let her. And that small gesture felt more intimate than any words they could have said in that moment. They began to meet outside the range, sometimes not often, but enough to blur the lines between training and something more. They went for long drives, on roads that didn't lead anywhere on purpose, walked through farmers' markets and bookstores without ever talking about the past, only the present, and sometimes the future. And it didn't scare them the way it used to. He told her about the nightmares, about the nights when sleep felt like the most dangerous part of the day, and she didn't pull away. She didn't pity. She just stayed, and that was enough. And she told him about the pressure, the weight she had carried for years trying to be enough, for everyone but herself, and he listened without fixing, and that was enough too. Their connection became something rooted not in what they shared, but in what they allowed each other to feel in the spaces that used to be filled with noise. There was quiet, and in the quiet, they found something like trust, something like healing, something like love. But still they did not speak the word because the word wasn't the point. The point was showing up and staying and breathing through the recoil. Together, one night she brought her old pistol, the one she used the first day they met, and he smiled when he saw it, said, "I remember that one." And she said, "Yeah, I remember that day." And they stood in the booth, side by side, firing slow, steady rounds. Like it was a ritual now, like it was more than muscle memory, like it was sacred. And when the last shot landed clean in the center, he looked at her and said, "I've trained a lot of people, but you showed me what it means to teach again." And she smiled not because of the compliment, but because she knew exactly what he meant. And as they walked out of the range together under a sky full of stars, they didn't say goodbye because they never needed to. They just kept moving forward, step by step, shot by shot, story by story. She didn't realize how much she had changed, until one morning she looked in the mirror and saw someone who no longer flinched at the silence, who no longer searched for control in all the wrong places, someone who no longer carried her doubts like armor, but instead stood grounded steady like a shooter who knew her target and trusted the shot. And she knew it wasn't just the training that had done this. It was him. It was every quiet moment, every look, every lesson wrapped in stillness and strength. They had fallen into something unspoken and unbreakable, something built not on words or promises, but on time and trust, and the space they gave each other to just be themselves. She had stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop because he never made her guess, never played games, never made her question what she meant in his world. He showed her every Thursday, every shared silence, every calm correction, and she showed him in return by showing up not just to shoot, but to listen, to be present, to stay one. Thursday, he brought her a gift. Nothing wrapped, nothing grand, just a worn canvas pouch with her initials stitched into the corner. When she opened it, she found custom ear protection molded perfectly to her and a pair of shooting gloves lined with something soft and warm, and she looked up at him, unsure how to say thank you in a way that matched what it meant, and he just shrugged like it was nothing and said, "Figured you should have gear that fits you," and she didn't cry, but she wanted to. Because it wasn't just the gift. It was the thought. It was the way he remembered it, was the way he saw her. She started keeping a journal around that time, not to write down what happened, but to capture how she felt, to remind herself of the way her chest settled when she stepped into the booth beside him, of the way her hands no longer trembled, of the way he had become a part of her rhythm. Like breathing, like aiming, like finding the center again and again. And she filled pages with small things, the way he drank his coffee, Black no sugar. The way he always double-checked his scope even when it was already perfect. The way his voice softened only for her. They planned another trip out past the city limits this time, to a place he said she needed to see. It was farther than the last one, deeper into the woods. Off a dirt road no one had used in years. He brought a different rifle this time, shorter stock matte black. A weapon he said had history, and when he handed it to her he said, "This one's yours now." And she froze for a second, heart caught in her throat, not because of the rifle but because of what it meant. You don't give someone a rifle unless you trust them, unless you see something in them, and she looked at him and saw the truth sitting quietly in his eyes, not loud, not demanding, just there. And she took the rifle from him slowly, held it with both hands like it was sacred, and she whispered, "Thank you," and he said, "You earned it," and that was all. They spent the whole day out there firing, talking, sitting in silence, sometimes saying everything without saying anything, and as the sun began to fall behind the trees, he turned to her and said, "I used to think I'd never be able to come back. Not really. But you brought me home without even trying." And her breath caught again, not because of the words, but because of the way he said them, like truth, like gravity, like a promise. She reached for his hand this time, not as a question, but as an answer, and he took it, held it without hesitation. And for the first time, there were no more walls, no more holding back, just two people finally letting the world in, just enough to feel it, just enough to say, "This is real," without saying it. At all later, they packed the gear slowly like they always did, careful, deliberate, like nothing should be rushed, like everything deserved its time. And when they climbed into the truck, they didn't turn on the radio, didn't speak for a while, just watched the road stretch ahead under the rising stars. And she knew in her bones that whatever this was, whatever it had become, it was built to last, not because it was perfect, but because it was real, because it was earned shot by shot, truth moment by moment, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of what came next. The morning felt different somehow. Quieter, but not in a heavy way, just in the way that things feel before something new begins. The sun had barely risen, casting soft gold across the street as she parked in front of the range, her usual spot, waiting for her. As if it had always known she would return, she stepped out of the car, steady sure no longer the woman who first walked into this place with something to prove, but someone who had already proven everything that mattered to herself and to him. He was already inside, setting up lanes, checking equipment, moving with the calm focus that had always defined him. She watched him for a moment from the doorway, hands in her jacket pockets, heart steady but full. She thought back to that first day, to the sharp sound of her own frustration and the quiet power in his voice when he had corrected her aim, and now standing here all this time later, everything felt like a full circle, not a finish line, but a moment that knew its own meaning. Looked up when she stepped in, and his face softened in that way it always did when he saw her. The kind of look that spoke volumes without asking anything, the kind that said, "I'm glad you're here," without ever needing to say it out loud. She walked toward him, their movements instinctual, now handing off gear, checking targets, moving like they had done this for years, and maybe in some way they had not, in calendar years, but in time that mattered, in time that healed. They fired a few rounds, side by side, not rushing, not competing, just breathing through the shots, letting the rhythm of the range guide them, and when they stopped, he turned to her and said something different today, and she nodded, curious but trusting as always, and he handed her a small box, not heavy but solid, her name carved into the lid with the precision of someone who knew what every stroke meant. She opened it slowly, careful fingers lifting the lid to reveal a medal nestled inside, not one of military origin, but one he had crafted himself, engraved with a single phrase in clean etched lines. Aim, steady, breathe, true, and below it, her initials and his. She looked up at him, eyes wide with disbelief, and something deeper, something wordless and full, And he said, because you earned this, and because you reminded me how to earn myself again. There were no speeches, no dramatic declarations, just the quiet hum of the range and the way her hand closed over his and the way he let it stay there, solid and warm. And certain later, they stood outside under the sky that had started to brighten with the weight of a coming summer, and she said, "What now?" Not afraid, not anxious, just open. And he smiled that rare smile and said, "Whatever we want, we keep showing up. Keep pulling the trigger, keep trusting the aim in each other." So they did. In the weeks that followed, they kept meeting. Not just at the range, but everywhere that felt right. They fixed up the old field where he had first trained her clearing brush, rebuilding targets, setting up new lanes so others could learn too. He started teaching again. Slowly, one student at a time, veterans, young shooters, people who had stories and scars and wanted to feel steady again, and she helped quietly but fully, guiding hands, adjusting stances, listening more than she spoke. The place began to fill with life, with echoes of laughter and the soft sound of brass hitting gravel, and it wasn't about the shooting. Not really. It was about finding center. It was about remembering that steady hands often came from steady hearts, that the lessons learned through sights and recoil often reached deeper than expected. One evening after the last student had gone home, they stood by the fire pit behind the range, watching the flames dance in the wind, and he said, "I never thought peace would feel like this." And she leaned her head against his shoulder and said, "Maybe peace isn't a place. Maybe it's a person." And they stayed like that until the fire burned. Lo, and the stars came out bold and clear and full of stories. They didn't need to rush to tell. They never labeled what they had, because it didn't need a label. It just needed space and time and truth. They lived it moment by moment. One shot, one breath, one shared silence at a time. And in every one of those moments they found something neither of them expected, something lasting, something earned, something that grew stronger, the more they trusted it. And so the woman who walked into the range searching for control, and the man who had once been defined by war found something better than either of them had known to look for. Not perfection, not rescue, but real, unshakable connection forged through fire and patience and the steady rhythm of two lives choosing to walk forward side by side, always aiming steady, always breathing true, always staying close enough to hear the silence speak.